Hey, how's it going? I'm Julius Thomas. I'm the Dr. Omar Eldakar. Just want to tell everybody out there, the listeners from the Society for Neurosports, thanks. We have a really great episode for you today, episode 3 of the Expert Mind Body podcast. We're going to talk a little bit about evolutionary biology, why it's important, how it can help us maintain health, perform in life, and performance settings better, and kind of how it ties into the field of sports neuroscience. So Omar, thanks for agreeing to be on the podcast. Appreciate you coming on. So we'd like to just start off with a little introduction. Tell us a little about you so the audience can kind of see you as a person and not just as a professor, researcher, scientist. Maybe you can start with just kind of your background and maybe your education.
All right. So thanks for having me. Well, I grew up in New York, and it was actually interesting because I was mostly into sports growing up. I really didn't have that much of a affinity for academic life at all. So I ended up going to college on an athletic scholarship, and then while I was in college studying biology, I took a class under David Sloan Wilson on human evolution and behavior, and I was just captivated at that point. And then that was kind of the transition point where I really went from, almost like just jock, who cares about classes, to really kind of think, oh, I really like this stuff, and athletics is only going to last for so long, So from that point on, I really got kind of hooked in research in biology, evolutionary biology, looking at social behavior, like why cooperate and such. And then I went off to Arizona, University of Arizona, for a postdoc in the Center for Insect Science. And then ended up coming here, and it's only until very recently that I actually bring those sort of two parts of my background together, where I was sports early and then sort of science later. Did I now bring them both together and now look at things like neurosports? So that's kind of a recent phenomenon. So that's a little bit of background.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you some follow-up questions because I think you're being just a little bit modest when you're talking about your former athletic pursuits. Tell the audience, what sports were you involved in, at which levels, so we can kind of see you not just as the researcher, but also as the athlete. And then I'm going to ask you to take a little bit of a surface level dive into human evolution and behavior. What was it that was interesting for you, and kind of what captivated you about that and made you want to start this second passion in research and biology?
So I ran track and field. That was the big thing that I did. I was a sprinter. It's kind of funny when you're in high school, you might be a really quick 100-meter dash guy, and you get to college in Division I, and they say no, that speed doesn't work up here.
Speaking of biology, huh?
Yeah. So I ended up doing it was middle distance sprints, middle distance in college, 400s mostly, sometimes 800s. But yeah, I ended up going competing Division I at Binghamton University. Go Bearcats.
There we go.
They have a hell of a team. They keep doing really well. They just had one of their guys in the Olympic trials for the mile. Really good. So anyway, I was pretty successful, I suppose, athletically. And the funny thing is, when I came here and we had this exercise science program, they do studies all the time, high twitch, low twitch, caffeine, this, that. And I jumped in one of those studies, and it was neat because that was almost the first sort of introduction of, using my athletic background, or considering my athletic background, and also considering where I am academically. Because in that study, when they genotyped us, that's when I realized or found out that I was homozygous with a high twitch muscle.
So you're supposed to be fast.
I was supposed to be a sprinter. Yeah, exactly. So I was like, wow. And my first thoughts were like, wait a second. I started immediately going back to, the college days, where I was like, imagine if the coach had this information. He was like, you know what, you're just going to go into that event. We're not going to mess around with this and wait till you to kind of falter and try to figure out what your sweet spot is. We're just going to dump you in areas based on what your body essentially is telling us, or what it's almost built for. So it's really kind of cool to see it in that context, and also help give me a really good excuse for why, when I run really long distances, I just get worse and worse as it goes further along. It really will help bring those two sort of together.
But what about human evolution in behavior. Like, I have not taken any of those courses. When you said that that's kind of what pulled you in, what was it that it was that aha moment, that resonating point that said, all right, this is for me?
Well, when I lived it, to kind of immediately just again relate to my own, again, I never really looked at sports or athletics from an evolutionary perspective. It's kind of obvious now, but I never really looked at it from that perspective until again I got to see how my own how basically how my body is constructed, I suppose, was better for certain things and not so much for other things. Yeah. And then it's interesting to dive in that further and look at human evolution and find out that actually we're adapted to be long distance runners, not sprinters. So while my sort of genotype and phenotype might be, good now in these sort of these sports, it might have been a liability back then. They start running after something, hunting, gathering. So I guess how getting to human evolution, how humans acquired food. We were hunter gatherers. So principally what happened is the males would run off and go hunt things, and the females would typically gather things. And when males would run off, when they'd run after something, they wouldn't just run this thing down and use, just massive feats of strength to take down this animal. Like, no way.
Yeah, we weren't cheetah hunters.
Yeah,
we were different.
Yeah, you can't even catch a squirrel, and even if you try to go after something like a wildebeest, if you were able to catch up to it, it's about at least twice as fast as we are. It can hold top speed for like 4 minutes. We can hold top speed for like 10 seconds. And they're faster. But let's say you were able to catch up to that thing. Now what? It's just going to kill you. It's going to maul you and all your friends that surrounded it. So how do you take that thing out, before it kills you? So ultimately, what humans would do is they would jog after this thing because we were running on the 2 legs. That's much more energy efficient than on all 4s. It's about a quarter of the energy you're spending on 2 legs. We're obviously the hair is very thin, so we sweat like crazy. So all of these are very efficient. And on top of that, our muscles, I mentioned high twitch, low twitch. We were predominantly low twitch. And that's really actually the main difference between us and like chimpanzees when they're really strong. It's really because they're just straight up high twitch monsters. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So we were basically these low twitch efficient beings, and we would just jog at you. So you just pick one of these big animals. We're not like lions. We don't go to the sick or little baby ones. No, we go after the biggest one that's out there with the biggest horns, and you run after that thing, and then you just chase after it. Eventually, it's going to get tired, and you catch up to it because you're nice and efficient, and then it freaks out, starts running off again, and you just keep jogging after it. And eventually, it's just going to become exhausted. They can't sweat like we can. They have to stop and pant. Again, the muscles are not nearly as efficient. And what's interesting too is that our comfortable sort of efficient jogging pace is just fast enough to force these animals from what would be a comfortable sort of trot for them to a gallop, which is way more costly. So we force them into this awful sort of grueling race and just jog after this thing, and eventually heat exhaustion, you kill it and take it back. And that's kind of how we accomplish this thing. So it's interesting seeing that, how we're these sort of gracile, efficient endurance running species that's not very strong. And then now we look and we see all these, we want to build muscle and get big and strong, and football was blasting into each other. And go, wow, because it's completely, counter to what you'd think that what we'd be evolved for, and getting into, I guess, the benefits of understanding evolution.
It's interesting because it kind of sounds like what's happening is here are all these prey animals, and they're so used to being hunted by these powerful, fast predators that now they've adapted towards being able to do these short bursts of escape. And then here along comes humans, and we have these different muscle fibers that really allows us to be persistent hunters. And it's kind of like the loophole that allows us to still find a way to be, I guess, semi-successful as predators. I'm sure over time we kept getting better and better with additional tools, but that was kind of how we used our competitive advantage in these early hunter-gatherer cultures. But it's interesting now to think about how evolutionary biology can help humans in kind of what you explained a little bit today was here's the modern day performance, but also in maintaining health. And how important is understanding evolutionary biology to helping the current everyday human be able to manage health and whether that's diet, nutrition, exercise?
It's a great question, and obviously evolutionary biology is very important to understanding health. Even though our modern environment is not like it was then, so why would evolution, when we weren't evolved, we're not living in that environment, so why would it be relevant here? It's just something from the past. But it's extremely relevant because if you know what shaped your body and what your body is good for, good at, then you know also what it's not, sort of good at. So, for example, one of our most amazing adaptations are our ability to quickly store fat and use fat. So we have these big brains. I don't know if you notice, we have these big brains, right?
Yeah.
Now we have these large brains, 1,600, about 4 times the size of a chimps brain, right? But they're costly. It's really costly to maintain.
Yep.
And if that brain is cut off of sugar for just a minute, you can have permanent brain damage. So how do you keep feeding this just incessantly hungry brain? Well, you do that with fat. So you have fat on your organs that help supplement that. You have fat in your muscles that help supplement that. But we're gonna put we're gonna put this, So that's where the fat on the rest of the body really comes into play to help keep that brain sort of fed in between meals. And now also you have to run after things in the endurance hunting way and power the brain while you're doing that. So you could see that having fat and being able to store fat and being craving fat and always desire, even if you just fill up on fat, you're still like more fat, So those, again, great adaptations because you need that to be a successful human and catch food and not go brain dead. But ultimately, what happens if you don't have to do that? What happens if you're not having to run after something now? You can just walk over to the refrigerator. Those cravings, those cravings are still there. Those evolved cravings are still there to drive you to these foods. Yet you're not expending the energy required to accomplish that. So ultimately, again, one of these brilliant adaptations in storing and metabolizing fat is a complete liability now. When you think of, again, this incessant craving for fat and not doing it. And that's where really exercise comes in, And that's another funny thing to think about because exercise, why is something that's just completely brand new important for human health? You'd think that why would that even be a factor? And it's because exercise, again, even though it's a completely modern phenomenon that doesn't really fit into the obvious evolutionary story, it fills that gap of the energy we're not expending. So if you're built, again, to do these long sort of persistence hunting bouts or even gathering too, that's not easy. If you have to do all these things, but now you don't do those anymore, that's where really exercise kind of steps in. So when you think about what kind of exercise would be good for humans, probably endurance hunting type stuff. But then again, there's going to be individual differences there because someone like me, genetically, not the greatest endurance runner, So should that alter my specific exercise program? Just like I can't digest milk. So that's not part of my natural diet, but if you can digest milk, hey, have at it.
That's very interesting because it makes me think about 2 concepts that kind of become important for people in maintaining their health. Number one is, how is evolutionary biology important? Why should we talk about it today? Well, because if you're not doing things that the body requires from an evolutionary perspective, you start to see dysfunction. And we know all of the illness and disease burden associated with lack of exercise. And it's crazy how this magic activity, physical activity, starts to really allow our body to operate at its best level. But it was interesting what you said is that the human body was adapted to easily retain fat. So then I started thinking, well, does that mean that leanness was a risk factor in evolutionary times? And these people that their bodies were just better at kind of holding on to these fat in the muscles and midsection or whatever. Now that was really good. You would have been killing it 15,000 years ago, but today, now you have to be more careful with what you eat. You have to be more disciplined and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, just think like red meat, bad. So all we were eating. Not only eating red meat, but clearly eating a whole lot of red meat. Like a third of the diet was basically just red meat. But when you're running around, when you're exercising, you're producing more HDL levels to bring your, the bad cholesterol down. And so yeah. I mean, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
But we were just talking about kind of how important evolutionary biology is, because one, you can understand if you know what humans are adapted for, and you're aware of that can help you in maintaining your health. But if you know if humans are not adapted for, that's also important because you can avoid that. And you talk about some of their adaptations, but what's something that humans are really not adapted for that we do a lot of now that can kind of create some problems for us?
Well, one funny thing is what we're not adapted for is actually exercise.
Really?
When you think about purely just the notion of exercise, that's getting up and doing something that's physically demanding when you don't really have to do it. You should for your health, and yeah. But it's maladaptive for an animal to just jump up and start running laps. I mean, you think if people are on a deserted island somewhere and they're, lying off the sign to help, to try to attract, passerbyers.
Yeah, SOS.
Yeah, like if you're on that island, you're trying to conserve as much energy as possible. You're not waking up and going for a morning jog, then making yourself some bacon and eggs. And it's not going to work that way. You should not use any energy if you do not absolutely have to. That's why if you overfeed your cat, it gets fat. If you feed your dog too much, it gets fat because it's just going to go, I don't have to do anything for this. Yep. So one thing we're really, really, really not adapted for is actually to go and exercise. And that's why we know it's healthy for us. The benefits are obvious. There's too many to even list. The lack of exercise, as you mentioned, is it's one of the major risk factors essentially for cardiovascular disease and things like metabolic disorders. So ultimately, that's why it's so tricky, because we are adapted to crave and eat as much fat as possible, but we're not adapted to exercise. But normally you have to put that energy to get that stuff. So ultimately, again, because we're adapted to be as lazy as possible, it really creates this we refer to as evolutionary mismatch. And that's really you're evolved for this set of conditions or this environment. Yeah. And now you're living in this other environment with different conditions. So doing what was previously adaptive behavior might be completely maladaptive now. Classic example, you see the little sea turtles, right? They pop out of the sand and they know where to go because they follow these evolutionary cues of, go after the light because the sun's reflecting off the water, and go after the sound because that's where all the noise is. And that's brilliant. I mean, it's a brilliant adaptation. It works flawlessly in nature. But when you throw a bar up, across the street, they're just going to go, wait a second. So that's more light and more sound over there. And there's these little sea turtles. They're just running to the bar, and not because they're little alcoholics. They're just completely mismatched for the world they're living in. And we're the same thing.
And that's interesting because it makes me think about how many other things are we doing culturally to create these evolutionary mismatches. And then it goes back again to why is it important to understand evolutionary biology? Because if you're an individual or a culture, you might want to limit those evolutionary mismatches as much as you can, because what you're doing is you're straining the human body and the nervous system. What other evolutionary mismatches are there that you either think about or you've read about that maybe some people might find interesting to know, or they might be able to use it to help themselves be less mismatched with the way that their body was designed to work?
Oh, that's a good question. I think of things like obviously like fat and laziness as obvious evolutionary mismatches, but even things like sleep scheduling, like people are not sleeping very much nowadays, and that's incredibly important for your bodies to maintain.
Yep.
And also imagine imagine an ancestral human that's kind of stuck awake at night and moving around. Their body's going to think that they're starving or something's really wrong. So the hormonal profile of these individuals that aren't sleeping as much is almost what's happening in a body that it's basically stressed out. It wants to eat more and eat high calorie sort of density foods, and that's completely unhealthy as well. So another mismatch is lack of sleep, and then that could contribute to a whole slew of neurological disorders. because you can imagine, what is that? The lymphatic system, I believe, in the brain helps clear the brain of chemicals while you're sleeping at night.
Fluid coming in.
Yeah, and so if you're not sleeping as much, not only are you building up more toxins, but you're removing less of them. So every minute you're not sleeping is a twofold problem. So that's one of the major ones I see.
It's so important. It took me a long time to understand why stay in bed, why try to get that 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Well, it's because of these sleep cycles. Each additional sleep cycle is giving your brain that opportunity to heal and recover from whatever it was that you did that day. I guess this is time to kind of ask for Omar's life hacks, the knowledge of evolutionary biology. What understandings of evolutionary biology do you use in your own life to kind of maybe, I don't know, live healthier or interact better, or even around your own home that you kind of have that added benefit of studying and writing about this that you use in your everyday life?
That's a good question too, because it does, obviously, it's hard to read all these things and understand all these things and not apply it to your own life. And that's why it's kind of cool to study things like human biology and human evolution, because it's directly applicable. So things for me, I mean, coincidentally, I already ran track, when I was younger, but that knowing or understanding our evolutionary history as endurance runners, that's why when I exercise, I do endurance, oriented exercise, even though, again, I'm not suitable for that necessarily, but I know that that's what my body is it's meant to do. And you find that a lot of people that jog will complain about knee injury, ankle injuries, back, and a lot of it's because they have improper form. And that's another sort of thing where understanding evolutionary biology comes in, where it's really about, the classic, like, if you heel strike, it just causes all this extra stress on your joints, and that's why it causes people to break down. But if you just midfoot strike and you run how you're supposed to run, things end up going a whole lot better for you. So just even understanding that changed my stride after I actually ran track. So that was another.
What's the difference between a heel strike and a midfoot strike? I mean, I think you and we've had to do so many practices of proper running form, so it just becomes intuitive for us. But maybe for some of the listeners, what's that difference? Like, where is the sweet spot on the foot to be landing to, I guess it would just be to align the biomechanics?
Yep. So real quickly, we have two really important springs, more, but there's two really ones to pay attention to. And one's the arch of the foot. It's kind of like this. So when it hits the ground, it'll flatten. So if you hit on the ball of your foot, let's say it's the ball is your heel, if you hit like here, it'll actually flatten that out, and then that provides another spring to when it has to sort of reform. So if you hit your heel on the ground, you're not necessarily going to get that same sort of effect, for one. Also, when you hit your heel on the ground, you're kind of landing in front of you as opposed to on the periphery.
If I'm wrong, that's what they call a braking force.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you want to stop, you start more slamming your heels down. Yeah, so it's always kind of strange. But normally, if you were to see people that are running, when they're heel striking, and you say, oh, hey, take your shoes off and run across the parking lot real quick, they're not going to be heel striking. They might do the first step, and then they're going to get jarred into correct form. And then the other important spring is actually the Achilles tendon. So the arch, I think that basically accounts for about 17% of the force that you apply to the ground is returned. Achilles tendon is about 35% of the force that when you apply to the ground is returned to the Achilles. So if you're hitting your heel on the ground, you're not really stretching that out. So if you hit the ball of your foot again on the ground, your heel's almost floating a little bit, so it allows your Achilles to really handle that springing action instead of just blasting your heel into the ground. Again, normally you would notice this discomfort of your heel striking and stuff like that, but these running shoes that have sort of that high offset. So those are two really sort of very, very sort of critical springs, again, when it comes to running, and engaging those properly is actually going to put more effort on your soft tissue as opposed to the hard stuff that might fall apart.
And I mean, that makes perfect sense what a great understanding to have. And then for somebody that ran track, did this at a high level, to then be able to study evolutionary biology and go, wait, I can still make improvements to basic movement patterns that you've been doing over and over and over. But what about diet? I'm sure that understanding what our ancient ancestors ate allows you to make dietary choices in your own life, whether that's, do you want to grow your own food? Do you want to keep a certain type of fats and meats around to really kind of eliminate some of those evolutionary mismatches?
That's true, because there's so many diets out there. There's so many diets. And obviously, anyone watching this would probably think that I would be like, oh, do the paleo diet, you know? But then you go, which paleo diet? You know, which one?
Yeah,
you know, there were some Neanderthal populations in Europe that didn't eat any meat. They ate just mushrooms and fungus for the source of protein. And there's other Neanderthal populations that their diet resembled those of wolves that were in the area too. So they're basically only eating meat. So those are both paleo diets, but they're completely different from each other. So it's really regional, and also based on your certain genetic capabilities. Again, I can't handle milk. So for someone like me, I'm like, oh, it's unnatural. Yeah, it's unnatural for me. But if you can, you have the genes capable of that. So it's the specific diet that a human should follow is not as straightforward because our diet changed for so long. But one thing is pretty consistent, and that's trying to limit these what do you call it, processed foods, and try to cut down on some of those carbs, because these processed foods, allows the sugar to hit your bloodstream much faster, and then usually your blood sugar goes up bad, and then you release insulin to bring it back down. You tend to overshoot, and that's why when you eat Taco Bell, you want Taco Bell like another hour later. So when you do these, you kind of, and then I guess another effect of that is, if you spoil your body with with this quick energy, it's going to get spoiled on that. I want that quick energy. That's why if you wake up in the morning and eat like Lucky Charms or something, you're gonna have a heck of a lot of energy. And then right when your body finishes burning through that, it just starts craving more, because I want more. And that's because you're not really engaging this process of you storing the fat and then using the fat the next day.
Which is what we would say how we evolutionarily used to use energy stores in the body. Now the body's like, wait, you made this easier for me. And I think that one thing that I've started to, it's a concept, I think it just goes across so many different areas in science, is that the human body's thrifty. And for me, it's almost so hard to understand that concept, because you spend so much time, in a country like America, where we're like, no, we want the best of the best. We may even have a propensity for greed, but thriftiness and how the body is so thrifty in so many ways. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Well, it's so thrifty, and that's why we have an obesity. It's one of the reasons we have an obesity epidemic, because your body's going, let's do that save that for later. Don't use that now. Save it for later. Just eat more of that quick carbs that you were able to pull in. Because of that thriftiness, your body should, again, want to eat as much fat as possible, store the fat, don't use it, if you don't have to. Don't do anything if you don't have to. So we are extremely efficient and thrifty organisms. And again, we're completely mismatched in an environment of an overabundance. We're perfect for an environment of scarcity, but completely mismatched in this environment of abundance. And again, in getting to dietary choices, not saying that, again, people should fast all the time necessarily, but you gotta imagine that a hunter-gatherer didn't wake up and eat a full, a bunch of fruity pebbles,
and go to the refrigerator, crack some eggs open, whip up some pancake batter, some flapjack, nice
hearty breakfast. So ultimately, again, like, you have to really think of your energy reserves and that when it comes to your diet. But again, if you're going to be a performance athlete, then you probably need to be hitting yourself with more of these carbs too. So it is
burning more energy probably than people who are evolutionarily, because, like you said, they were trying to conserve it. They weren't being in track practice at whatever time coach wanted you out there, and then going to lift, and then doing whatever else that we demand of our bodies these days. So another important thing I would like for you to talk about is this winner-loser effect.
Oh, yeah.
I think this is important to talk about how this stuff kind of ties into sports neuroscience. How does this evolutionary system we have in our brain, and you've kind of looked at it from a current perspective of winner-loser effect, and how this affects athletes, like literally in real time.
Yes, there's a lot of interesting evolutionary themes in athletics. For one, you just mentioned, like, you have to eat differently, obviously, than the ancestral individuals, because you're doing unnatural things. If you want to be a big giant bodybuilder, then we're not supposed to do that necessarily. So you have to do a lot of things you're also not supposed to do normally. Eat weird things and have a weird diet to do that.
Yep.
But another interesting theme is gets to the psychology of the athlete or individuals that are in contests. So this notion of winner and loser effects, it's pretty ubiquitous in the animal kingdom. It's this basic notion that animals compete over stuff all the time. Food, resources, territory, mates, and when these animals compete, one's going to win, one's going to lose in that immediate interaction. Now, if you just won or you just lost, you get some important information from that. You kind of get an idea of how good you are in this venture, and you get an idea of how good your competition is, right? So if you just got blasted and your territory taken from you, your mate taken from you, whatever, you might be injured, whatever. You're not good at what you just did.
Yeah.
So you probably want to be a little bit more reserved,
do less,
kind of withdraw a little bit, maybe think about another strategy.
Yeah.
If you just won, well, then you should have a positive feedback there to say, keep doing that. That was good. Now, the winner and loser effects, they're temporary, and they're typically attributed to underlying changes in hormones like testosterone and other stress hormones. So if you win a contest, individuals will have a surge of testosterone. When individuals lose a contest, they'll have a decrease in testosterone and elevation of these stress hormones. And as you know, testosterone makes you aggressive, sort of thing. So if you have more testosterone, you're more likely to win, for one. And if you won, you're going to get even more. You're going to like to keep winning, and you see it kind of feeds back. Yep. But they were temporary because things change. You get your butt kicked when you're 12. Things might be different when you're 25.
Yep.
So, but anyway, these effects they're temporary. In that sense, from that one encounter, they're temporary there, but they could or should have an influence on sporting contests. So, again, this is something that you see in all sorts of animals, again, ranging from insects to mammals. And again, you could see it, so you'd expect that it would influence contemporary sporting competitions, particularly those that are played in very close succession. So you just had a contest, now go back out there and do it again.
Yeah.
And also what's interesting is spectators have the same effect. So like fans watching their team lose, they will actually suffer a decrease in testosterone.
Wow.
Individuals watching their team win will have an increase in testosterone. And you can see it in these fans like have their little
you almost see it
team
between
logs.
quarters and halves. They come out after halftime, the crowd's dead.
Yep, and it's this really cool sort of carryover effect, and it can occur very rapidly. So I know that they attribute it to underlying changes, typically to underlying changes in hormone levels. But you can find these things happening immediately. So there's other things contributing it too. So for example, there is this really elegant study on tennis players where they looked at players that were evenly matched, basically I think within 5 rankings of each other. Yeah. And then they looked, so they had these contests, and then they only had contests between individuals that were, again, similarly matched, that fought to a long tie break in the first set. So you have evenly matched individuals, and they're tied after that first set. The winner of that set, the tie break, is significantly more likely to win the next set. And also the disparity in the score from that tie break also, influences the predictability of who's going to win the next set. So it carries over in that little bit. So that little bit can be the difference between, getting that momentum essentially, or not, or having the opposite effect happen.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because I think that's what sports neuroscience is all about. It's how do we take these evolutionary understandings, like this winner loser effect? And if you're a sports psychologist, you have to help your athlete overcome not just the cognitive or the psychological perception of I just lost, but also a hormonal change in their body. And that means you're going to have to even have more belief that that was just something that happened that last set and turn the page and go on to this next one. And how many more associations do you think we'll likely see in the future as we continue to do research in sports neuroscience and incorporate different fields like evolutionary biology?
Well, I mean, just even looking at winner and loser effects and just the questions that can just come immediately just arise from that. We go, wait a second, if you just won this contest, more likely to win the next one. How long does that last? You know, we just looked at it in college baseball and softball doubleheaders, but we specifically looked at how long it lasts in college baseball doubleheaders, because they play a game and they'll play the next game immediately after on the same day. But they also most of the time will play a game either the day before or the day after that. Mm-hmm. So what we find is that the contests played in the same day are more likely to be swept. So you either win both of them or lose both of them. Yeah. It's unlikely that
won that first one has a much higher percentage chance of winning that second one based on the winner-loser effect.
Yep. But it doesn't carry over to the next day. Or if you win the day before, it doesn't carry over to that doubleheader day. So it's really confined to that one day. So that was one thing we immediately thought about, is how long these last. But the question that immediately jumps out is, how can we manipulate this to our advantage?
Yeah.
You know, can we produce a winner effect before you can go out there to begin with?
Yeah.
And if you just lost, can you try to mitigate that by, you know, washing that out of your brain somehow? Mm-hmm. So one thing we think of is, are there already mechanisms that people do unknowingly that are taking advantage of this, that are actually manipulating these? And you think of the pregame speech.
Yeah.
There's always a pregame speech.
Yeah.
Always. There's always a, rah, let's go get them. So you already are creating that. So it's you imagine, like, okay, well, what if we manipulate this and have individuals watch a previous win? And they've done that in studies, and they see there's an increase in testosterone. You go, yeah, that works really well. Cool. But that's comparing it to nothing. You know, how about you give them the normal rah team like hype thing? What effect does that have on testosterone? You know, so are we already engaging in these things? You know, coaches don't go out there and give a, well, you know, just give it your best, guys. You know, we kind of suck. You know, no, they're always like, we got a chance. And then halftime, there is some change in some coaches are, you know, and you wonder, does that influence second half performance? Does it influence different players?
Yeah.
So another question after that we thought of is, because we looked at these effects also in professional baseball, and they're there, but they're pretty mild. But we didn't know if it's because they're professionals or if it's because when they do doubleheaders, it's like day-night doubleheaders, like 3 hours or so between. So maybe, you know, maybe that washes out of that much time, you know, in the professionals. But really, it probably, at least I hypothesize, it's probably because they're professionals, right? And the whole idea of being a professional athlete is having a short memory, right? Forget about that. And because if you can't get over that stuff, you're going to have inconsistent performance. We can have consistent, you know, performance going in the wrong direction sometimes. And
they might have selected you out of there. So no, I think that everything you said today is great. And I think you did a great job of tying into why evolutionary biology is so important as a discipline in and of itself, but especially in sports neuroscience. And we have time for just the one evolutionary biology hack. Like if you said, all right, this is the one thing, it could be for sports, it could be for nutrition, it could be for life. What's one piece of Omar's advice that anybody listened to, if they just caught this last 10 seconds and they're like, okay, I gotta implement one thing, what would you recommend?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say, just to keep on the theme of maybe of winner and loser effects, to try to focus on the good things that are happening in your life and not the negative things. And I know we were joking about this before, saying, you know, these winner and loser effects might be, you know, pervasive outside the context of sports. So imagine you had this embarrassing moment
Yep.
captured on video. Now that's on social media, and you're just getting bliss with that all the time. And what's happening to your psychology with that? But you can also just so you can be forced to experience worst moments of your life over and over and over again. You can also have the good moments at your fingertips too. So you can give yourself a sort of positive psychological environment, you can use it to your advantage. Essentially, if you get caught up on the bad stuff, it's almost like when people think bad stuff happens.
Yeah.
There is some truth to that, because again, they're probably underperforming because they're focusing on that so much. So I would say that, just from a mental health point of view.
Well, there you have it. If you want to have a way to use an evolutionary biology hack in your life, just play your highlight reel.
Exactly.
If you're down, play your highlight reel.
All the time.
If you need a win, play the highlight reel first.
Yep.
Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it as always.
Anytime.
And we'll have you on again.
All right, sounds good.